When James Hawk Harrison boarded Flight 847 from Seattle to Miami that morning, he never imagined his combat medical training would be needed again. A decorated Navy SEAL whose valor had saved dozens of lives in Afghanistan would soon face mockery from fellow passengers, only to become their last hope during a terrifying mid-air emergency that would test everyone's courage and change their lives forever. Harrison adjusted the straps of his well-worn backpack as he made his way down the crowded aisle of the Boeing 737. His military-issued canvas bag, covered in subtle patches from his various deployments, hung heavily from his right shoulder. He was wearing a simple gray T-shirt with Navy SEALs. The only easy day was yesterday, printed across the chest, a pair of faded jeans and comfortable hiking boots that had seen better days. At 52, his salt and pepper hair was cut short in a familiar military style, and despite the slight limp in his right leg, a reminder of a firefight near Kandahar, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a veteran operator. Late September morning had started typically enough. Harrison had woken up at 0500, maintaining the disciplined routine ingrained through 26 years of service. He was heading to Miami for a reunion with his old SEAL team, marking the 10th anniversary of their final mission together. That operation had earned him the Navy Cross, though he rarely spoke about it. The medal, like many of his decorations, stayed locked away in a wooden box at home, along with the memories of the brothers he'd lost. As he reached row 17, Harrison noticed the usual mix of reactions his presence tended to elicit. Some passengers glanced at his shirt with quiet respect, while others seemed deliberately indifferent. A young mother with 2 small children smiled warmly as he passed, perhaps sensing the protective aura that still emanated from him even years after retirement. An elderly gentleman wearing a Korean War veteran's cap gave him a knowing nod, which Harrison returned with practiced discretion. Reaching his assigned seat, 17C, Harrison realized he'd been placed in the middle, not ideal for someone with his frame and old injuries. The window seat was already occupied by a businessman, absorbed in his laptop, and the aisle seat remained empty, likely waiting for a last-minute passenger. Harrison stored his backpack in the overhead compartment, careful not to disturb the meticulously organized medical kit he always carried, a habit from his days as a combat medic that he'd never abandoned. The familiar pre-flight announcements droned overhead as Harrison settled into his seat, his right knee protesting slightly. The morning's damp Seattle weather hadn't done his old wounds any favors. He'd taken 2 rounds in that leg during an extraction mission in 2014, and though the doctors had worked miracles, some aches never fully disappeared. Weather changes always seemed to awaken those sleeping demons. Running his calloused hands over his knees, Harrison observed the continuing boarding process. The plane was filling up quickly, mostly with business travelers and families heading south for the lingering warmth of Florida's endless summer. The scent of coffee from the galley mixed with the artificial chill of the cabin air conditioning, creating that distinct atmosphere unique to commercial flights. Through the small window beside him, he could see ground crews scurrying about, their duties in the misty morning air, their fluorescent vests bright against the grey tarmac. His attention was drawn to a group of young passengers making their way down the aisle. 4 college-aged men, probably in their early 20s, were moving towards his row, their designer backpacks and confident demeanor suggesting privileged backgrounds. They were laughing among themselves, sharing something on a phone screen, their voices carrying above the general murmur of the cabin. One of them, wearing an expensive-looking leather jacket and sporting carefully styled blonde hair, was clearly the leader of the group. As they approached Harrison's row, the blonde one checked his boarding pass and smirked. "Looks like we hit the jackpot, boys," he announced, gesturing to the empty aisle seat next to Harrison. "Front row seats to the gun show." His friends snickered, and Harrison could feel their eyes examining his shirt, his bearing, his very presence. The comment wasn't particularly cutting, but the tone carried that peculiar mix of amusement and dismissal that Harrison had encountered before from those who had never served. The blond young man dropped into the aisle seat beside Harrison, while his friends took their places in the row behind them. Harrison could hear them continuing to make barely hushed comments, their phones now documenting their apparent amusement. At sitting next to what one of them referred to as G.I. Joe's grandpa, Harrison remained still, his face impassive, his mind drifting to similar moments of youthful arrogance he'd witnessed over the years. He'd learned long ago that true strength rarely needed to announce itself. The plane began its taxi to the runway, the engine's growing whine drowning out some of the ongoing commentary from his seat neighbors. Harrison pulled out the in-flight magazine, more as a shield than from any real interest in its contents. Behind him, he could hear the young men starting to record what they apparently thought would make an amusing social media post, complete with mock military salutes and exaggerated whispers about stolen valor, a phrase that momentarily caused Harrison's jaw to tighten, though his expression remained neutral. Little did any of them know that within the next 2 hours, their laughter would turn to desperate pleas for help, and the very skills they were mocking would become their only hope for survival. The initial mockery evolved into a more focused attempt to provoke a reaction from Harrison. The blond student, who had introduced himself loudly to his friends as Bradley Thompson III, made a show of scrolling through his phone, occasionally turning the screen toward his companions seated behind them. "Hey guys, check this out. Apparently anyone can buy these military shirts online now. Amazon's got them on sale," he announced with exaggerated enthusiasm. Harrison maintained his composure, continuing to flip through the airline magazine, while quietly observing the group's dynamics through his peripheral vision. Years of combat operations had taught him to stay aware of his surroundings without appearing to pay attention. Bradley's friends, he'd gathered their names were Chase, Tyler, and Mason from their ongoing conversation, seemed to feed off their ringleader's confidence. "So, old-timer," Bradley suddenly turned to Harrison, his voice carrying that particular tone of false politeness that barely masked contempt. "Which war movie inspired your fashion choice today?" The question was followed by poorly suppressed laughter from the row behind. Harrison could feel the businessman by the window shift uncomfortably, clearly aware of the growing tension, but choosing to remain engrossed in his laptop. Harrison slowly lowered his magazine, meeting Bradley's gaze with steady eyes that had seen far more than these young men could imagine. "It's not from a movie," he replied simply, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of commanding special operations teams. For a moment, something in his tone seemed to give Bradley pause, but the young man quickly recovered. His bravado, "Oh right, sorry. You must be the real deal then," Bradley continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me guess, you single-handedly won the war?" More snickers from behind. "Took down the bad guys with your bare hands?" The mockery was becoming more pointed, designed to elicit reactions from both Harrison and their growing audience of nearby passengers. A flight attendant passed by, picking up on the tension. She paused briefly, her expression questioning, but Harrison gave her a subtle shake of his head. He'd handled far more challenging situations than a group of privileged college students testing their boundaries. The flight attendant moved on, though Harrison noticed she kept glancing back toward their row. "Must be nice," Chase chimed in. "From behind, walking around with a shirt like that, getting thank you for your service discounts at Denny's." This earned him high fives from his friends, the sound sharp in the confined space of the cabin. The businessman by the window had now put in earphones, clearly trying to distance himself from the situation. Harrison's mind drifted to a morning in Kandahar province, where he'd led a medical evacuation under heavy fire, carrying a wounded Marine across open ground while bullets kicked up dust around them. The young Marine had been about the same age as these students. He'd survived thanks to Harrison's combat medical training and sheer determination. The memory brought a slight smile to his face. Not that these young men would understand its meaning. "Hey guys, maybe we should thank him for his service," Tyler suggested mockingly, pulling out his phone to record. "I mean, that's what you're supposed to do, right? Thank all these wannabe heroes?" The phone's camera lens pointed directly at Harrison, who remained still, his expression unchanged. He'd been under much more threatening surveillance in his career. Bradley seized on this new entertainment opportunity. "Oh, absolutely. We should definitely thank him. Sir." He turned to Harrison with an exaggerated salute that would have made any drill instructor cringe. "Thank you for your outstanding service to—" What was it again? The local paintball team? The group erupted in laughter, drawing disapproving glances from several nearby passengers. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, seated across the aisle, watched the scene unfold with wide, confused eyes. Her mother tried to distract her, but Harrison caught the child's gaze and gave her a reassuring wink. He'd learned long ago that maintaining dignity in the face of disrespect was its own form of strength. "I bet he's got some great war stories," Mason added, leaning forward between the seats. "Like that time he fought off an entire enemy army with just a pocket knife and dental floss." More laughter, more phone recordings, more subtle headshakes from surrounding passengers who seemed unsure whether to intervene. Harrison's right hand unconsciously moved to the faded scar on his forearm, a reminder of the night he'd actually used paracord and a combat knife to save his teammate's life, fashioning an emergency tourniquet during a mission that went sideways near the Pakistani border. The irony of their mockery wasn't lost on him, but he knew that true experience didn't need validation from those who couldn't understand it. The plane reached its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Bradley immediately adjusted, his seat back, deliberately bumping Harrison's knees in the process. "Oops, sorry there, soldier," he said with a smirk. "Guess you'll have to call in air support for that one." His friends continued their running commentary, now sharing their video clips on social media, adding captions that Harrison could hear them discussing in stage whispers. Little did they know that the skills they were mocking, the medical training, the calm under pressure, the ability to handle crisis situations, would soon become desperately needed. The emergency that was about to unfold would transform their sneers into pleas for help, and their mockery into desperate gratitude. But for now, Harrison simply sat there, decades of discipline allowing him to maintain his composure, while around him the seeds of a dramatic confrontation with reality were being unwittingly sown. The morning flight continued its steady course. Across the western United States, the gentle hum of the engines providing a constant backdrop to the cabin's atmosphere. Through the small window beside Harrison, patches of clouds drifted by, occasionally revealing glimpses of mountainous terrain below. The plane had been airborne for about 40 minutes, and the initial excitement of takeoff had settled into the familiar rhythm of mid-flight routine. Flight attendants began their first beverage service, pushing carts down the narrow aisles. The businessman by the window had fallen asleep, his laptop now closed and tucked away. Around the cabin, passengers had settled into their own routines, some reading, others watching movies on their devices, a few trying to catch some rest. The young girl across the aisle had started drawing in a coloring book, occasionally stealing glances at Harrison. Bradley and his friends had temporarily shifted their attention to a game they were playing on their phones, though they still made occasional comments about Harrison's presence. Their voices had dropped to a lower volume, but their words remained pointed. "Do you think he actually believes wearing that shirt makes him special?" Chase whispered, loud enough for Harrison to hear. "I mean, my Uncle Bob has a Purple Heart, but you don't see him advertising it everywhere." Harrison took a moment to observe the cabin more carefully, a habit ingrained from years of operational awareness. He noticed a middle-aged couple a few rows ahead, the man occasionally pressing his hand to his chest in what appeared to be discomfort. An elderly woman near the emergency exit was knitting something that looked like a baby blanket. Two flight attendants were discussing something in hushed tones near the galley, occasionally glancing at their watches. The plane encountered a patch of turbulence, causing slight bumps that made the overhead bins creak. Harrison noticed Bradley's knuckles whitening slightly as he gripped the armrest, a small tell that the young man's bravado might not extend to all situations. The turbulence passed quickly, but Harrison observed how some passengers remained tense, while others seemed completely unfazed. "Hey, military man," Bradley spoke up again, his voice carrying a forced casualness. "Did they teach you how to handle turbulence in boot camp, or was that advanced training?" His friends snickered, though Harrison noticed their laughter seemed slightly strained after the rough air. The businessman by the window stirred briefly, but didn't wake. A flight attendant approached their row with the beverage cart. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" she asked, her professional smile barely masking her awareness of the earlier tension. Bradley ordered a ginger ale, while Harrison politely requested water. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Alisa, seemed to linger a moment longer than necessary, her eyes conveying a silent apology to Harrison for the young men's behavior. As Alisa moved on to the next row, Harrison caught fragments of conversations from around the cabin. A mother was softly singing to her baby several rows back. Two businesswomen were discussing quarterly reports across the aisle, the constant murmur of human activity mixed with the mechanical drone of the aircraft, creating that unique atmosphere found only at 35,000 feet. Bradley pulled out his phone, again showing his friends something on social media. "Look, guys, our little video is getting some attention," he announced proudly. "Already got 50 likes. Should we do a follow-up?" Tyler leaned forward eagerly, his phone at the ready. "Maybe we could get him to do some drill commands for us," he suggested, earning appreciative chuckles from his friends. Harrison took a sip of his water, his mind drifting to another flight, a military transport over the Hindu Kush Mountains, where he treated 3 wounded Marines while the aircraft took evasive maneuvers to avoid enemy fire. The calm precision required in those moments had become second nature to him, a skill set that seemed worlds away from this commercial cabin, but remained ever present in his muscle memory. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing they were expecting more turbulence ahead and advising passengers to keep their seatbelts fastened when seated. Harrison noticed subtle changes in the cabin atmosphere, flight attendants securing loose items, passengers adjusting their positions, the general murmur of conversation dropping to a lower volume. "Bet you wish you had your parachute now." "A soldier," Mason called from behind, though his attempt at mockery seemed to carry a hint of genuine nervousness about the upcoming turbulence. Harrison remained silent, but his senses had heightened slightly, noting details that his years of training had taught him to monitor. The slight change in engine pitch, the barely perceptible shift in the aircraft's attitude, the way the light through the windows had dimmed as they entered a larger cloud bank. The plane began to shake more noticeably, causing Bradley to grip his armrest tighter. His friends had gone quiet, their earlier bravado temporarily forgotten as they focused on the turbulence. Harrison maintained his composed posture, his body naturally adjusting to the aircraft's movement in a way that spoke of countless hours in challenging conditions. Alisa and the other flight attendants made another pass through the cabin, checking that seatbelts were fastened and tray tables were secured. As she passed their row, Harrison noticed her glance at the middle-aged man he'd observed earlier, the one who had been touching his chest. Something in her expression suggested concern, though she maintained her professional demeanor. The cabin lights flickered briefly as another wave of turbulence hit the aircraft. Through the window, Harrison could see the wing flexing slightly, a normal occurrence he'd witnessed countless times, but one that seemed to unnerve Bradley, whose face had taken on a distinctly paler shade. The young man's friends had fallen silent, their phones now tucked away as they gripped their seats. In the growing tension of the moment, Harrison sensed that something more significant than turbulence was brewing, a feeling he'd learned to trust through years of combat situations. His instincts, honed by decades of military service, were telling him to stay alert. Though none of his fellow passengers could have known it, the veteran they had been mocking was already mentally preparing for whatever challenge might lie ahead. The turbulence gradually subsided, but Harrison's attention remained fixed on the middle-aged man seated a few rows ahead. Something about the passenger's posture and increasing frequency of chest touching triggered his combat medic's instincts. The man, wearing a Navy business suit that was now showing signs of stress-induced perspiration, seemed to be trying to mask his discomfort from his wife seated beside him. Harrison had seen similar behavior countless times in the field. Soldiers, attempting to downplay their injuries, not wanting to burden their teammates. The man's complexion had taken on a grayish tinge, and his breathing pattern showed subtle signs of distress that most passengers wouldn't notice, but were clear indicators to Harrison's trained eye. Bradley and his friends had resumed their earlier bravado as the turbulence eased, though their voices carried less conviction than before. "Maybe we should ask our resident hero if he's got any war stories about turbulence," Bradley suggested, but his attempt at mockery was interrupted by a sudden commotion several rows ahead. The middle-aged man had lurched forward in his seat, one hand clutching his chest while the other gripped the armrest with white-knuckled intensity. His wife's voice cut through the cabin's ambient noise. George, what's wrong?" The fear in her voice carried clearly to where Harrison sat, triggering an immediate shift in his demeanor from passive observer to active responder. "Help! We need help!" The wife's calls became more urgent as her husband slumped against her shoulder, his face contorted in pain. Elisa, the flight attendant, rushed forward, but Harrison could see the momentary flash of uncertainty in her eyes, the look of someone facing a situation beyond their standard training. Before anyone else could react, Harrison was on his feet, his movements so swift and purposeful that Bradley barely had time to withdraw his legs from the aisle. 2 decades of combat medical experience had taught Harrison that in critical situations, seconds could mean the difference between life and death. "Excuse me." Harrison's voice carried the quiet authority of command as he moved past Bradley and his friends, who had fallen suddenly silent. As he approached the distressed passenger, Harrison's mind had already shifted into the familiar pattern of combat triage: assess, stabilize, evacuate. The man, George, as his wife had called him, was now struggling to breathe. His tie, loosened but still constraining. His wife's hands fluttered helplessly around him, her face a mask of panic. Other passengers had begun to stand, craning their necks to see what was happening, creating the kind of chaos that Harrison knew could complicate an emergency response. "Sir, I'm a combat medic," Harrison announced, his voice calm but carrying enough authority to create immediate space around the affected row. "I'm here to help. Can you tell me what you're feeling?" He was already checking the man's pulse while speaking, his fingers finding the carotid artery with practiced precision. George managed to gasp out a few words. "Chest, tight. Left arm, numb." The symptoms, combined with Harrison's initial observations, painted a clear picture: a likely cardiac event, possibly a heart attack. In Afghanistan, Harrison had treated similar cases under far worse conditions, but the confined space of an aircraft at cruising altitude presented its own unique challenges. "Ma'am," Harrison addressed George's wife while maintaining contact with his patient, "how long has he been experiencing these symptoms?" His tone was gentle but focused, helping to center her scattered thoughts. He started feeling unwell about an hour into the flight," she managed, her voice shaking. He said it was just indigestion, but her words trailed off as George's condition visibly worsened, his breathing becoming more labored. Elisa had returned with the aircraft's medical kit, and another flight attendant was making an announcement, requesting any medical professionals on board to identify themselves. Harrison quickly scanned the contents of the kit, his mind already cataloguing available resources against potential needs. "I need space and light," Harrison commanded, his voice carrying the same tone that had once directed medical evacuations. Under enemy fire, passengers who had gathered around stepped back immediately, responding to the natural authority in his voice. Bradley and his friends, now standing in their row, watched in stunned silence as the man they'd been mocking took control of the situation with practiced efficiency. "Elisa," Harrison addressed the flight attendant while beginning to loosen George's clothing, "I need you to inform the captain that we have a possible cardiac event. We may need to divert to the nearest airport with appropriate medical facilities." His hands moved with precise efficiency, years of treating casualties under fire evident in every motion. The cabin's atmosphere had transformed completely. The earlier mundane flight routine had given way to a tense focus centered on the unfolding emergency. Harrison could feel the eyes of every passenger on him, including those of Bradley and his friends, but his attention remained entirely on his patient. George's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and Harrison knew the next few minutes would be critical. As he worked, Harrison's mind flashed briefly to a similar situation in Helmand Province, where he'd kept a Marine alive for 3 hours after a massive heart attack, waiting for a medical evacuation helicopter while under sporadic enemy fire. The skills he'd developed then, the ability to remain calm under pressure, to make quick decisions with limited resources, to inspire confidence in those around him, were now being called upon once again, thousands of feet above the American heartland. "Listen to me carefully, George," Harrison spoke with measured clarity while preparing the medical equipment from the kit. "I know you're scared, but I've handled situations like this before. We're going to get through this together." His hands moved with practiced precision as he attached the portable heart monitor from the aircraft's emergency kit, each motion deliberate and efficient. The cabin had fallen completely silent except for George's labored breathing and the steady hum of the engines. Even Bradley and his friends had pressed themselves against their seats, their earlier mockery forgotten as they watched Harrison work with an expertise that no amount of pretense could fake. "Elisa, I need aspirin from the medical kit, 325 milligrams if you have it," Harrison directed while monitoring George's vital signs. The heart monitor showed an irregular rhythm that confirmed Harrison's initial diagnosis. His mind quickly ran through the protocols he'd used countless times in combat zones, adapting them to the current situation. The flight attendant returned with the aspirin while another crew member brought oxygen. Harrison's voice remained steady as he explained each step to George and his wife. "The aspirin will help thin your blood, and the oxygen will make breathing easier. I'm going to stay right here with you." His calm confidence seemed to have a stabilizing effect on both patient and passengers. George's wife clutched her husband's hand, tears streaming down her face. "He had bypass surgery 2 years ago," she managed to say. "We were supposed to see our grandchildren in Miami." Harrison nodded, absorbing this crucial information while continuing his assessment. The mention of previous cardiac surgery added another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a medical emergency, we will be diverting to Kansas City International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The announcement triggered a wave of murmurs throughout the cabin, but Harrison remained focused on his patient. "Heart rates elevated, blood pressures concerning," Harrison muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His fingers moved to check George's carotid pulse again, comparing it with the monitor's readings. Years of treating casualties under fire Worse conditions had taught him to trust both technology and his own senses. From behind him, Harrison heard Bradley's voice, now stripped of all its previous arrogance. Is there anything we can do to help?" The question caught Harrison's attention briefly, not for its content, but for the complete transformation in the young man's tone. Where there had been mockery, there was now genuine concern, and perhaps a hint of shame. "Actually, yes," Harrison responded without looking up from his patient. "I need someone to time the intervals between his chest pains and keep track of his breathing rate." He heard shuffling as Bradley and his friends moved closer, eager to be useful. "Chase, you do it," Bradley directed, his voice carrying a new note of respect when addressing Harrison. "He's on the swim team. He's good with timing." Chase moved forward, his phone's stopwatch ready, all traces of his earlier disdain gone. Harrison gave him clear instructions on what to monitor, his voice the same one he'd used to train young medics in the field. The other passengers watched, in silent awe as the scene unfolded, the mocking college students now working alongside the veteran they'd ridiculed, all under Harrison's calm direction. George's condition continued to deteriorate despite the initial interventions. Harrison noticed subtle changes in his skin color and the quality of his pulse that raised red flags in his experienced mind. "Elisa," he called to the flight attendant, "how long until we land?" 20 minutes to Kansas City, she responded, her own professional calm enhanced by Harrison's steady presence. Harrison nodded, his mind already calculating what needed to be done in that time. He'd once kept a wounded SEAL alive for 40 minutes in the Hindu Kush with nothing but a basic medkit and sheer determination. This situation, while different, required the same focus and resourcefulness. "George, stay with me," Harrison commanded, noticing his patient's consciousness starting to waver. "Tell me about those grandchildren you're going to see." It was a technique he'd used countless times in combat, keeping patients engaged, giving them something to focus on beyond their pain and fear. The next few minutes became a focused blur of activity. Harrison continued monitoring vital signs, while maintaining a steady stream of calm conversation with George. Chase diligently called out breathing rates and pain intervals. Tyler and Mason had taken it upon themselves to keep other passengers informed and calm, while Bradley assisted Elisa in preparing for landing. Harrison's hand never left George's wrist, monitoring his pulse with the kind of attention to detail that came from years of treating casualties under the most extreme conditions. Every slight change in rhythm told a story his experienced fingers could read. The irony wasn't lost on him. How the same hands these young men had mocked were now working to save a life at 35,000 feet. Through it all, Harrison maintained the composed demeanor that had served him through countless combat missions. But inside, he knew they were racing against time. George's symptoms were worsening, and even with the oxygen and medication, his condition was becoming increasingly unstable. The next 15 minutes would put all of Harrison's combat medical experience to the test as he fought to keep his patients stable until they could reach definitive care on the ground. "Blood pressure's dropping," Harrison announced, his voice maintaining its professional calm despite the gravity of the situation. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he adjusted the oxygen flow and rechecked vital signs. The aircraft had begun its descent into Kansas City, the subtle change in cabin pressure adding another complication to an already critical situation. George's condition had deteriorated significantly in the past few minutes. His skin had taken on a dusky pallor, and his breathing had become increasingly labored despite the supplemental oxygen. Harrison recognized the signs of someone approaching cardiac shock, a condition he'd treated too many times in combat zones around the world. "Chase, what's his current breathing rate?" Harrison called out, his eyes never leaving his patient. The young man, who hours earlier had been part of the mockery, now responded with military-like precision. 28 breaths per minute, sir, up from 24 3 minutes ago. The transformation in Chase's demeanor was striking. The earlier sneering tone replaced by focused professionalism. Elisa returned with updated information from the cockpit. Emergency services will be waiting at the gate. ETA 12 minutes. Harrison nodded, his mind already calculating what needed to happen in those crucial minutes. He'd once stabilized a wounded Marine during a longer descent under heavy fire. This was different, but the principles remained the same. Keep the patient alive, maintain stability, handle complications as they arise. "George, stay with me," Harrison commanded, noticing his patient's eyes starting to flutter. "Tell me more about those grandchildren." George's wife squeezed her husband's hand, tears streaming down her face as she watched Harrison work. The veteran's steady presence seemed to be the only thing holding the situation together. Bradley, who had been helping to keep the aisle clear, suddenly spoke up. "Sir, his lips are turning blue." Harrison had already noticed this development, cyanosis, a sign of poor oxygenation. He'd seen it countless times in the field, and, while the sight still concerned him, his response was automatic and decisive. "Elisa, I need the emergency oxygen supply from the forward cabin," Harrison directed, his voice carrying the same authority that had once commanded special operations, medical teams. "And I need a space cleared by the exit row. We may need to lay him flat, depending on how this progresses." The descent continued, each minute marked by the steady beeping of the heart monitor and Chase's careful counting of vital signs. Other passengers sat in tense silence, many praying, others watching in amazement as Harrison coordinated what had become a well-organized emergency response at 30,000 feet. "Blood pressure 70/40, Harrison muttered, his experienced fingers detecting the weakening pulse at George's wrist. The numbers were concerning, but he'd stabilized patients with worse in far more challenging conditions. "Tyler," he called to another of the formerly mocking students, "I need you to help me move him into a modified Trendelenburg position." Tyler stepped forward immediately, all traces of his earlier attitude gone. "What do you need me to do?" The question came with genuine readiness to help. Harrison quickly instructed him on how to help adjust George's position to maximize blood flow to his vital organs, a technique he'd refined during numerous combat casualty situations. The plane hit a patch of turbulence during its descent, causing the cabin to shake. Harrison steadied himself while maintaining his grip on George's wrist, his body automatically compensating for the movement as he'd done countless times in military aircraft under far worse conditions. Bradley and his friends braced themselves as well, but remained at their assigned posts, following Harrison's lead with newfound respect. 7 minutes to landing, the captain's voice announced over the intercom. Harrison could feel the aircraft's descent becoming steeper. George's condition was becoming more critical with each passing minute, but Harrison's face showed no sign of the concern he felt. He'd learned long ago that in medical emergencies, the care provider's demeanor could influence the patient's chances of survival. "Mason," Harrison called to the fourth student, "I need you to monitor his breathing pattern. Any change in rhythm, you tell me immediately." Mason nodded, moving into position with the same seriousness he'd earlier used to mock Harrison's military service. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the cabin. George's wife had been watching everything with increasing anxiety. "Please," she whispered to Harrison, "please save him." Harrison met her eyes briefly, conveying the same quiet confidence that had once reassured families in war-torn villages. "Ma'am, I've handled situations like this before. We're going to get him through this." The plane suddenly banked, beginning its final approach. The movement caused George to groan, his consciousness flickering. Harrison immediately adjusted his position, his hands moving with the swift precision of someone who had treated casualties in actively moving vehicles under combat conditions. "Approaching final descent," the captain announced. "Emergency services standing by." Harrison could feel the difference in the aircraft's attitude, the subtle changes in pressure and motion that indicated they were nearly there. But George's condition was deteriorating faster than their descent. "Stay with me, George," Harrison commanded, his voice carrying the same authority that had once kept wounded soldiers fighting for survival in the mountains of Afghanistan. "We're almost there. Think about those grandchildren. Think about holding them in your arms. That's an order, soldier." The aircraft touched down with greater force than usual, the pilot prioritizing speed over comfort. Harrison braced himself, while maintaining his position beside George, his body automatically adjusting to the impact as he'd done countless times in military aircraft. The sudden deceleration sent a wave of tension through the cabin, but Harrison's focus remained unwaveringly on his patient. "Chase, vital signs," Harrison called out, his voice steady despite the chaos of landing. The young man responded immediately. Heart rate 130, breathing 32 and shallow, last blood pressure reading 65/35. The numbers painted a grim picture, but Harrison had seen worse, had saved patients from worse, in conditions far more challenging than this. The aircraft turned sharply toward its emergency parking position, the engine's roar diminishing. As they taxied, through the windows, Harrison could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles already positioned on the tarmac. The scene reminded him of nighttime medevac operations, though the Kansas City airport's bright fluorescent lights were a far cry from the darkness of Afghanistan. "Secondary oxygen tank ready," Bradley announced, having taken charge of the backup medical supplies with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. The transformation in his demeanor was complete, the sneering college student replaced by someone who understood the gravity of real emergency response. The plane came to a stop, and within moments the cabin door was being opened. The blast of fresh air that rushed in carried the distinct sounds of emergency personnel preparing to board. Harrison maintained his position, knowing that these transition moments were often the most critical. "Medical team coming aboard," Elisa announced, her professional calm enhanced by the controlled atmosphere Harrison had established. The passengers remained seated, their earlier panic replaced by an almost reverent silence as they watched the veteran continue his life-saving efforts. The paramedics entered efficiently, their equipment ready. Harrison began his handoff brief. With the practiced precision of someone who had conducted countless medical transfers under pressure. "Patient is George Sullivan, early 60s, history of cardiac bypass. Symptoms began approximately 40 minutes ago, including chest pain, left arm numbness, and shortness of breath. Current vitals are unstable with signs of cardiogenic shock. We've administered aspirin and supplemental oxygen." The lead paramedic nodded appreciatively at the thoroughness of Harrison's report. It was the kind of detailed yet concise briefing that could only come from extensive experience in emergency medicine. The EMT team quickly began their own assessment, while Harrison continued to monitor George's condition during the transition. "Sir," one of the paramedics addressed Harrison, "were you traveling with the patient?" Harrison shook his head. "No, I'm a former Navy SEAL combat medic. I was seated a few rows back when the emergency began." The paramedic's eyes showed immediate understanding and respect, one medical professional recognizing another. As the emergency team prepared to transfer George to their stretcher, his wife turned to Harrison, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, gripping his arm. "If you hadn't been here—" Harrison gently patted her hand, the same gesture he'd used to comfort countless families in crisis situations. "He's in good hands now, ma'am. The Kansas City Medical—" team knows what they're doing. Bradley and his friends had gathered nearby, their earlier arrogance replaced by a mixture of awe and shame. They watched as Harrison helped the paramedics secure George to the stretcher, his movements displaying years of experience in patient transfer. Every gesture was purposeful, every action coordinated with the emergency team's efforts. "We've got a cardiac unit standing by at St. Luke's," the lead paramedic announced. "Transport time approximately 12 minutes. Harrison nodded, recognizing the efficiency of the emergency response system. It was a far cry from the hours-long evacuations he'd managed in combat zones, but the principles remained the same. Swift, coordinated action could mean the difference between life and death. As the paramedics began to move George toward the exit, his wife following close behind, Harrison performed one final check of the patient's vitals. It was a habit ingrained through years of medical operations, never abandoning a patient until the handoff was completely finished. The other passengers watched in respectful silence as George was evacuated from the aircraft. Many had their phones out, recording the scene, but not with the mocking intent that had characterized the earlier videos. Instead, they were capturing something else, the quiet competence of a veteran whose training and experience had potentially saved a life. Elisa approached Harrison as he began to collect and organize the medical supplies they'd used. "That was incredible," she said softly. "In 15 years of flying, I've never seen anyone handle an emergency so professionally." Harrison gave a modest nod, the same response he'd given to similar praise throughout his career. Bradley stepped forward, his earlier swagger completely gone. "Sir," he began, his voice thick with emotion, we... He gestured to his friends, who stood behind him with equally chastened expressions. Harrison met their eyes steadily, seeing in their faces the same transformation he'd witnessed in young recruits, who'd first scoffed at training only to understand its value when reality struck. The cabin remained strangely quiet, the usual post-landing bustle replaced by a collective processing of what they'd just witnessed. Harrison could feel the shift in how he was perceived, from an object of ridicule to someone whose capability and character had been demonstrated beyond any doubt. "The captain has advised that we'll be delayed here in Kansas City for approximately 2 hours while necessary reports are filed," Elisa announced to the cabin. "You're welcome to deplane and use the terminal facilities." The passengers began gathering their belongings, but no one seemed in a hurry to leave. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed into something almost reverential. Harrison moved back to his seat, his movements betraying a slight fatigue that comes after intense focus. As he settled in, he could feel the lingering soreness in his right leg, the old combat injury making itself known after the prolonged period of emergency response. The businessman by the window had long since gathered his things and deplaned, leaving an empty seat that somehow emphasized the space. "Between Harrison and Bradley, sir," Bradley spoke up, his voice carrying none of its earlier mockery. "I need to apologize." He paused, struggling to find the right words. What I did, it was completely out of line." His friends nodded behind him, their faces showing genuine remorse. Chase still held the notepad where he'd been recording vital signs, his knuckles white around its edges. Harrison turned to face them, his expression neither condemning nor forgiving. "You know," he began, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "in the field, we learned pretty quickly that you can never judge someone's worth by their appearance. I've seen young soldiers fresh out of training perform incredible acts of courage, and I've watched decorated veterans freeze under pressure. It's not about the uniform or the t-shirt. It's about what's inside." Tyler stepped forward, his phone clutched in his hand. "We've deleted all the videos we took earlier," he said quietly. "It seems so stupid now, what we were doing." Harrison and nodded, acknowledging the gesture. Mason added, "When you jumped up to help, it was like watching a completely different person. The way you knew exactly what to do. That comes from training and experience," Harrison explained, his tone softening slightly. "Every emergency situation I handled in combat prepared me for moments like this. When you're in the field, you learn that life can change in an instant. The same skills that kept my teammates alive in Afghanistan just helped save someone at 35,000 feet. Several other passengers had gathered nearby, listening respectfully. An elderly gentleman spoke up. "I saw similar things in Vietnam, medics working miracles under impossible conditions, but I never thought I'd witness something like this on a commercial flight." His voice carried the understanding of someone who had seen both the horrors and heroics of war. Elisa returned with an update. "The hospital called. Mr. Sullivan is stable and receiving treatment. His wife wanted me to pass along their deepest gratitude." The news brought visible relief to the cabin. Harrison closed his eyes briefly, offering a silent prayer of thanks, a habit he developed after countless emergency responses. Bradley seemed to be wrestling with something internal before speaking again. "My brother's in the Marines," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I always give him a hard time about it, joke about him playing soldier. But watching you today, I think I finally understand what it really means to serve." Harrison studied the young man's face, seeing genuine understanding beginning to dawn. "The uniform, whether it's military, fire, police, or medical, isn't about glory or recognition," he explained. "It's about being ready to help when help is needed. Every training exercise, every deployment, every hardship builds toward that readiness." Chase spoke up, his voice carrying a new note of respect. "How long did you serve, sir?" Harrison's mind briefly flashed through his years of service, the faces of teammates, the thunder of combat, the quiet moments of camaraderie between missions. 26 years with the SEALs, he replied. 18 of those as a combat medic, retired 3 years ago, but as you saw today, some skills never leave you." The other passengers listened intently, many nodding in understanding. A mother holding a sleeping child whispered, "Thank God you were on this flight." Harrison acknowledged her comment with a modest nod, the same response he'd given countless times when thanked for his service in combat zones. "The thing about emergency medicine," Harrison continued, addressing not just Bradley and his friends, but the gathered crowd, "is that it teaches you to focus on what matters. When someone's life is on the line, it doesn't matter what they look like, what they believe, or how they treated you 5 minutes ago. All that matters is keeping them alive." Elisa approached again, carrying a bottle of water and some snacks. "Courtesy of the crew," she said, placing them near Harrison. "The captain would like to speak with you when you have a moment." Harrison thanked her, though his attention remained on the young men who had undergone such a dramatic transformation in their understanding. "Sir," Bradley spoke up again, his voice stronger now. Would you be willing to tell us about your service? The real stories, not the jokes we were making earlier." The question carried genuine interest, a desire to understand rather than mock. His friends leaned forward, equally eager to learn. Harrison considered the request, taking a sip of water. He rarely spoke about his experiences, but he recognized the teachable moment before him. "Tell you what," he began, "instead of war stories, let me tell you about what service really means, about the times when training and preparedness made the difference between life and death, about why we wear these shirts and carry these memories." The young men settled into nearby seats, their earlier arrogance replaced by attentive respect. Other passengers remained gathered around, drawn by the authenticity of the moment. Harrison began sharing carefully chosen stories, not of combat glory, but of teamwork, sacrifice, and the unwavering commitment to helping others that defined his years of service. As he spoke, Harrison could see understanding dawning in their eyes. These weren't the sanitized Hollywood versions of military service they'd obviously expected, but real accounts of human courage, technical skill, and the profound responsibility of holding others' lives in your hands. The same responsibility they'd just witnessed firsthand during George's emergency. 2 hours into their delay in Kansas City, Harrison's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from George's wife. "The doctors say if you hadn't acted so quickly, George might not have made it. They're calling it a major cardiac event. You truly saved his life. We'd love to thank you in person if possible." Harrison read the message, quietly, sharing the update with the small group that had remained gathered around him. "That's what it's all about," Harrison explained to Bradley and his friends, who had spent the last hour listening intently to his carefully chosen stories of service. Not the medals or recognition, but the lives you touch. Every person you help becomes part of your own story. The young men nodded, their earlier superficial understanding of service transformed by the events they'd witnessed. Elisa approached their group again, her professional demeanor softened by genuine respect. "The hospital is only 15 minutes from the airport," she announced. "Several passengers have asked if we could arrange a brief visit before our rescheduled departure to Miami." She glanced at Harrison, gauging his reaction. "Mr. Sullivan's family specifically requested it." Harrison considered the proposal, his mind working through the logistics as he'd done countless times in the field. "What's our new departure window?" he asked, the practical soldier in him emerging. Elisa consulted her tablet. "We're cleared for departure in 3 hours. The crew needs to complete incident reports, and we're waiting for a replacement medical kit." Bradley suddenly spoke up, his voice carrying a new sense of purpose. "Sir, if you're willing to visit the hospital, we'd like to go too." His friends nodded in agreement. We'd like to apologize to Mr. Sullivan and his family. They should know how we acted earlier and how wrong we were." The admission carried genuine remorse and a desire for redemption. Harrison studied the young men's faces, seeing in them the same transformation he'd witnessed in countless young soldiers who'd learned hard lessons about judgment and respect. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the most important part of making a mistake is owning up to it and learning from it. That takes its own kind of courage." A retired schoolteacher who had been sitting nearby spoke up. "I have a rental car reservation at the airport. I'd be happy to drive you all to the hospital." Other passengers began offering similar assistance, the earlier crisis having forged an unusual bond among the strangers who had witnessed it. As arrangements were being made, Harrison noticed Chase looking thoughtfully at something on his phone. "What is it?" Harrison asked. Chase looked up, slightly embarrassed. "My younger brother, he's been thinking about joining the military as a medic. I used to tell him it was a waste of time." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I'm going to call him tonight, tell him what I saw today. Tell him I was wrong." The impact of the day's events continued to ripple through the group. Tyler had been quietly researching combat medic training on his phone, while Mason had struck up a conversation with the Vietnam veteran about his experiences. Bradley sat slightly apart, composing what appeared to be a long message to his Marine. "A brother, sir." Bradley looked up from his phone. "My brother's unit is stationed at Camp Pendleton. He says he knows about you, about what you did in Afghanistan." Harrison's expression remained neutral, but those who had been listening closely could detect a subtle shift in his demeanor. "Your brother's name?" Harrison asked quietly. "Lieutenant James Thompson," Bradley replied. "He says you saved his commanding officer in Kandahar province 3 years ago. Some kind of massive firefight." Harrison's mind flashed back to that desperate night. The chaos, the impossible odds, the determination to keep everyone alive until help arrived. "Captain Rodriguez," Harrison said softly. "Good man. Hard fighter." The revelation sent a new wave of shocked understanding through the group. Bradley's face had gone pale. "All this time, I've been mocking the very person who—" His voice trailed off, overwhelmed by the connection. Harrison reached out, placing a steady hand on the young man's shoulder. "That's why we never judge by appearances. Every person you meet might have a story you couldn't imagine." Elisa returned with updated information about the hospital visit. A small group would go: Harrison, Bradley and his friends, and a few other passengers who had helped during the emergency. The airline had arranged for transportation, and the hospital was expecting them. As they prepared to leave the aircraft, Harrison gathered his few belongings, including the well-worn backpack that had accompanied him through countless missions. Bradley noticed him checking something in a side pocket. "Medical supplies?" he asked, his tone now carrying genuine interest rather than mockery. Harrison nodded, unzipping the pocket to reveal a compact but comprehensive medical kit. "Force of habit," he explained. "In the field, you learn to always be prepared. Never know when those skills might be needed." The same kit had been crucial in providing initial care to George before the aircraft's emergency supplies arrived. The small group made their way through the terminal, drawing curious glances from other travelers. Word of the mid-air emergency had spread, and some people seemed to recognize Harrison from descriptions shared on social media. He maintained his modest demeanor, deflecting attention with the same quiet confidence he'd shown throughout his career. As they waited for their transportation outside the terminal, Bradley turned to Harrison. "You know what's crazy?" he said, shaking his head slightly. "This morning, we thought we were going to make some funny videos about a guy in a military shirt. Instead, we ended up learning what real service looks like." His friends nodded in agreement, their earlier prejudices replaced by genuine understanding. Harrison looked at the young men, seeing in them the potential for growth that he'd witnessed in so many young soldiers over the years. "The most valuable lessons," he said, "often come when we least expect them. The key is being willing to learn from them." The hospital corridors were quiet as Harrison led the small group toward the cardiac care unit. The fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell reminded him of military hospitals, though the peaceful atmosphere was a far cry from the chaos of combat medical facilities. Bradley and his friends walked behind him, their earlier boisterous attitude replaced by respectful silence. "Mr. Sullivan is in room 412, the nurse at the station informed them, recognizing Harrison from the description she'd been given. "His wife said to send you right in." She glanced curiously at the group of young men accompanying the veteran, but Harrison's commanding presence seemed to answer any questions she might have had. George's wife met them at the door, her eyes filling with tears at the sight of Harrison. Without warning, she embraced him tightly. "The doctor said if you hadn't acted so quickly," she began, her voice breaking with emotion. Harrison returned the hug gently, the same way he'd comforted countless families during his years of service. "How is he doing?" he asked, his tone carrying professional concern. "Stable," she replied, wiping her eyes. "They're going to do a procedure tomorrow, but they say he should make a full recovery." She looked past Harrison at Bradley and his friends, who stood awkwardly in the hallway. "Are these the young men who helped?" she asked. Harrison turned to them, seeing an opportunity for growth in this moment. "They learned some important lessons today," he said carefully, "and they'd like to say something to you and George and that's all right." Bradley stepped forward, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine humility. "Ma'am," he began, his voice shaking slightly, "we need to apologize for how we acted on the plane before everything happened." Inside the room, George was propped up in bed, looking pale but alert. Various monitors beeped steadily, displaying vital signs that Harrison automatically assessed with a medic's trained eye. The older man's face brightened when he saw Harrison. "My guardian angel," he said weakly. Extending his hand, Harrison took it firmly, professionally checking George's pulse even as they shook hands, a habit ingrained through years of medical practice. "Just doing what I was trained to do, sir," he responded modestly. "How are you feeling?" George managed a small smile. "Like I've been through hell, but the doctors say I'm lucky. Lucky you were there." Bradley and his friends had entered the room behind Harrison, their faces showing a mix of shame and relief. George looked at them curiously as Bradley stepped forward. "Sir," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "before you got sick, we were making fun of Mr. Harrison, mocking his military service, recording videos, and—" He paused, struggling with the words. "We were being complete idiots," Chase added, stepping up beside his friend. "We thought it was funny to joke about someone's service, about their sacrifice, and then we watched that same person save your life." Tyler and Mason nodded in agreement, their eyes downcast. George listened quietly, his expression thoughtful. His wife had moved to stand beside his bed, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. "You know," George said finally, his voice weak but clear, "when I was your age, I probably would have done the same thing." He looked at Harrison with respect. "Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to understand what real courage and service look like." Harrison watched the interaction with quiet satisfaction, recognizing the profound impact this experience would have on these young men's lives. He'd seen similar transformations in young soldiers who'd initially approached their service with bravado, only to discover its true meaning in moments of crisis. "The videos we took," Tyler spoke up, "we deleted them all, but—" He hesitated, looking at Harrison. "We'd like to make a new one, not to mock, but to honor, to show people what real service looks like." Harrison raised an eyebrow, and Tyler quickly added, "Only if you're comfortable with it, sir. We just think people should know what happened today." George's wife wiped fresh tears from her eyes. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said. "People need to see that there are still heroes among us, still good people ready to help strangers in need." She looked at Harrison with gratitude. Even if those strangers didn't deserve it. Harrison considered the proposal carefully. He'd always avoided publicity, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. But he recognized that this story might serve a greater purpose. "If it helps others understand the importance of service and respect," he said finally, "then I'm willing to participate." Bradley pulled out his phone, but his hands were shaking slightly. "I don't even know how to begin," he admitted. "How do you tell a story like this?" Harrison stepped forward, his natural leadership emerging once again. "Start with the truth," he advised. "Start with what you learned today about judging others and about the real meaning of service." As Bradley began recording, Harrison noticed the young man's Marine brother had texted again. Bradley showed him the message. "That SEAL who saved someone on your flight? He's a legend in the community. The things he's done, taking care of others isn't just his job, it's who he is." The room fell quiet except for Bradley's voice as he began to tell their story. Harrison stood slightly apart, watching these young men take their first steps toward understanding what he'd known all along. That true service isn't about recognition or glory, but about being ready to help others in their moment of need, regardless of circumstances or past actions. George reached for his wife's hand, squeezing it gently as he listened to Bradley's heartfelt narrative. The steady beeping of the monitors provided a rhythmic backdrop to the story, unfolding in that hospital room. A story of prejudice transformed into respect, of mockery turned to gratitude, and of the enduring power of selfless service. 3 weeks after the incident, Harrison sat at his desk in his modest Seattle home, reading through the stack of letters that had arrived since the video of his mid-air rescue went viral. Bradley's sincere and powerful retelling of the events had resonated with millions of viewers, sparking conversations about respect, service, and the quiet heroes living among us. The young men's transformation from mockers to advocates had added a particularly powerful dimension to the story. Among the letters was a detailed update from George and his family. His recovery was progressing well, and his grandchildren had finally gotten to visit him in Miami after he was cleared for travel. The photo enclosed showed George surrounded by smiling children, one of them proudly wearing a toy stethoscope. Inspired, the letter explained, by the hero who saved Grandpa in the sky. Harrison's phone buzzed with a message from Bradley. "Sir, thought you'd want to know. I just helped my brother organize a veteran appreciation event at his base. The video inspired a whole program about respecting our service members. They've asked if you'd consider being a guest speaker." Harrison smiled slightly, remembering the brash young man who had mocked his service just weeks ago. The media attention had been unexpected and, initially, unwanted. But Harrison had come to recognize that this incident had created an opportunity to address broader issues about how society views its veterans and service members. He'd carefully chosen which interviews to accept, focusing on those that allowed him to emphasize the importance of preparation, respect, and the ongoing commitment to service that many veterans maintain long after leaving active duty. Chase had emailed the previous day, sharing that he'd enrolled in an EMT certification course. "What I saw you do on that plane," he wrote, "made me realize that having these skills isn't about glory or recognition. It's about being ready to help when help is needed." The young man who had once timed Harrison's actions with mocking intent was now timing his own response rates in emergency simulations. A knock at the door interrupted Harrison's reading. It was Mike Anderson, his old teammate from the SEALs, now working as a paramedic instructor. "Thought I'd find you hiding in here," Mike said with a grin, entering the study. "Still avoiding the spotlight." Harrison gestured to the letters covering his desk, trying to keep up with the responses. "Never expected any of this." Mike picked up one of the letters, scanning its contents. "You know, what happened on that flight? It's having ripple effects throughout the veteran community. I had a class of new EMT trainees yesterday. 3 of them cited your story as their inspiration for signing up." He paused, looking at his old friend. "Sometimes the greatest service is inspiring others to serve." Harrison stood, walking to the window that overlooked Puget Sound. The water was calm today, reflecting the overcast sky in shades of steel gray. "I've been thinking about something George's wife said at the hospital," he reflected, "about how people need to know there are still heroes among us. But it's not about being a hero, it's about being prepared, being willing to step up when needed." Mike nodded, understanding his friend's perspective. "You've always been that way, even back in training. Remember that night in Bud S when Martinez was struggling during Hell Week? Everyone else was focused on their own survival, but you still found the energy to help him through it." Harrison remembered. It was the same instinct that had driven him to act on the plane, the same commitment to never leaving anyone behind. A new email notification popped up on Harrison's computer. Tyler had sent a link to a follow-up video. The young men had compiled stories from other passengers on that flight, creating a powerful documentary about the impact of one person's readiness to serve. The comments section was filled with veterans sharing similar stories of using their training in unexpected civilian situations. "The thing is," Harrison said, turning back to his friend, "that flight showed exactly what I've always tried to teach, that the skills we learn in service aren't just for the battlefield, they're for life." He picked up one of the letters, this one from a retired Marine who had performed CPR on a stranger the week after watching Bradley's video. "It's creating a ripple effect of preparedness and responsibility," Mason had taken this lesson particularly to heart. His latest update described how he'd started a campus organization promoting emergency preparedness and veteran appreciation at his university. The group had already organized several events pairing student volunteers with veteran mentors, breaking down the barriers of misunderstanding that had led to his own prejudices. The wall of Harrison's study displayed his service. Medals, including the Navy Cross, but they were arranged simply without ostentation. Below them now hung a new frame containing the handwritten thank you note from George's grandchildren, their crayon drawings of an airplane and a uniformed figure standing guard over their grandfather, adding a touching humanity to the military. "Honors, Elisa called yesterday," Harrison mentioned to Mike, referring to the flight attendant. "The airline's implementing a new training program for crew members, specifically focused on identifying and utilizing passengers with medical or emergency response backgrounds." He smiled slightly. "Apparently, they're using the flight as a case study in professional emergency response at altitude." Another message arrived, this one from Bradley's Marine brother. He was organizing a workshop for new recruits about the ongoing importance of their training, even after leaving active duty. "Your story resonates with these young Marines," he wrote. "It shows them that the skills they're learning aren't just for deployment. They're life skills that make them valuable members of society long after they take off the uniform." Mike picked up a newspaper clipping from Harrison's desk, one of the more thoughtful articles about the incident. It focused not on the drama of the mid-air emergency, but on the broader implications of how society views its veterans. The writer had interviewed Bradley and his friends about their transformation from mockery to understanding, using their story to illustrate the importance of looking beyond superficial judgments. "You know what impresses me most about all this?" Mike said, setting down the article. "It's not just about the medical emergency. It's about how you handled those young men. You turned what could have been a moment of justified anger into a teaching opportunity." Harrison nodded, remembering the look of dawning understanding on their faces as they worked alongside him during the crisis. The afternoon light was fading over the Sound as Harrison and Mike continued their discussion. They talked about the future, about the programs being developed, the lives being influenced, the subtle but significant shifts in perspective that had emerged from that seemingly routine flight. The incident had become more than just a mid-air emergency response. It had evolved into a catalyst for change in how people view service, preparation, and the ongoing commitment of veterans to their communities. As the sun set over Seattle, casting long shadows across Harrison's study, he reflected on how a single flight had created such far-reaching impact. It wasn't just about saving one life, though that remained the most important outcome. It was about the ripple effects. Chase pursuing emergency medical training, Bradley rebuilding his relationship with his Marine brother, Tyler and Mason becoming advocates for veteran appreciation, and countless others being inspired to prepare themselves to help others in need. The story had transcended its initial viral moment to become something more meaningful, a reminder that true service continues long after the uniform comes off, and that the ability to help others is a gift that keeps on giving, often in the most unexpected moments and places. 6 months after the flight that changed so many lives, Harrison found himself back at Kansas City International Airport. This time, he wasn't just passing through. He was there by invitation, speaking at a special ceremony where the airport was unveiling a new program dedicated to improving emergency medical response capabilities across all flights. The initiative had been inspired by what the media had come to call the Harrison Protocol. George and his family were there, having flown in from Miami for the occasion. He looked healthy and vibrant, a stark contrast to that critical day 6 months earlier. His grandchildren wearing matching shirts that read, "Our Grandpa's Guardian Angel," couldn't stop asking Harrison questions about his military service, their innocent curiosity a far cry from the mockery he'd faced that fateful day. Bradley and his friends had also made the journey, each of them transformed by their experience. They sat in the front row of the small ceremony, their faces showing pride rather than shame, as airport officials described the events that had led to this moment. Bradley's Marine brother, now stationed nearby, stood in his dress uniform at the back of the room, beaming with pride at his younger sibling's growth. "What we witnessed that day," the airport director began, "wasn't just an emergency response. It was a testament to the ongoing value of our veterans' training and their commitment to service long after leaving active duty." Harrison sat quietly as the director continued, his thoughts drifting to the countless letters he'd received from other veterans sharing similar stories of using their training in civilian emergencies. Chase, now halfway through his EMT certification, caught Harrison's eye and gave a respectful nod. The young man had found his calling in emergency medicine, inspired by witnessing Harrison's calm expertise during the crisis. His instructors reported that he brought the same attention to detail to his training that he'd shown when tracking vital signs during George's emergency. The Harrison Protocol, the director explained to the gathered crowd, isn't just about medical response. It's about recognizing and utilizing the valuable skills our veterans bring to civilian life. The program would include special training for flight crews in identifying passengers with emergency response backgrounds, creating a database of volunteers willing to assist in-flight emergencies, and establishing better communication protocols between aircraft and ground medical teams. Elisa, who had been promoted to lead flight attendant trainer, stepped up to the podium. "What I remember most about that day," she shared, "wasn't just Mr. Harrison's medical expertise. It was how he transformed a group of young men from mockers to helpers, teaching them the true meaning of service even in the midst of crisis." Bradley and his friends shifted in their seats, their embarrassment at their past behavior now tempered by pride in how they'd grown from the experience. Tyler had brought his laptop, showing anyone who was interested the documentary series he'd created about veterans serving their communities in civilian life. What had started as a viral video about the flight had evolved into a powerful narrative about the ongoing impact of military training and the importance of respect for those who serve. The series had already been picked up by several major networks and was being used in schools to teach students about service and character. Mason, who now ran one of the largest student veteran support organizations in the country, shared updates about their latest initiatives. The group had expanded beyond its original scope of emergency preparedness to include mentorship programs, connecting veteran professionals with students interested in similar career paths. "It all started with a lesson in humility at 35,000 feet, he explained to a reporter covering the event. During a break in the ceremonies, Harrison found himself standing near the window, overlooking the runway, where their flight had made its emergency landing 6 months earlier. Mike Anderson joined him, both men watching planes take off and land in the late afternoon sun. "You know," Mike said quietly, "what happened that day is still rippling through the service community. We're seeing more veterans stepping forward, offering their skills and experience in their communities." The ceremony included the dedication of a small plaque in the terminal, commemorating not just the emergency response, but the larger lesson it had taught about respect, service, and the importance of being prepared to help others. Harrison had initially resisted such recognition, but had come to understand that the plaque wasn't really about him. It was about the principle of continued service and the breaking down of prejudices. George's wife approached Harrison during the reception, tears in her eyes as she showed him recent photos of their family. "The grandchildren ask about you all the time," she said softly. "We've told them that sometimes angels wear Navy SEAL t-shirts." Harrison smiled, remembering how differently his shirt had been perceived at the beginning of that flight. Bradley's Marine brother pulled Harrison aside for a private conversation. "You didn't just save a life that day," he said earnestly. "You helped save my relationship with my brother. He understands now what I could never explain to him about service and brotherhood." The transformation in Bradley's attitude toward military service had healed a rift between the brothers that had been growing for years. As the event drew to a close, Harrison was asked to say a few words. He stepped to the podium reluctantly, still more comfortable with action than speeches. "Service doesn't end when we take off the uniform," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded attention on the flight. "The skills we learn, the values we embrace, the commitment to helping others, these become part of who we are. That flight 6 months ago wasn't about heroism. It was about being prepared, being willing, and being there when needed." He looked out at the gathered faces. George and his family, Bradley and his friends, Elisa and the airline staff, his fellow veterans, and the next generation of emergency responders they were helping to train. In their eyes, he saw understanding of a truth he'd known throughout his career, that true service is not about recognition or glory, but about maintaining the readiness and willingness to help others whenever and wherever the need arises. The sunset over Kansas City painted the sky in shades of gold and purple as the ceremony concluded, its light reflecting off the windows of the terminal where millions of travelers would pass, many of them walking by the small plaque that told a story not just of an emergency response, but of transformation, understanding, and the enduring power of service to others. 1 year to the day after the flight that had changed so many lives, Harrison stood at the podium of the Navy SEAL training facility in Coronado, California. The audience before him consisted of fresh-faced recruits, seasoned veterans, and a special group seated in the front row. Bradley, Chase, Tyler, and Mason, each now involved in different aspects of emergency response and veteran support services. "We never know when our training will be needed," Harrison began, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "We never know when a routine flight might become the moment that defines not just one life, but many." He glanced at the young men in the front row, remembering their transformation from mockers to advocates, from boys to men who understood the true meaning of service. The presentation screen behind him showed a familiar scene, the viral video that Bradley had created, now viewed by millions, showing the aftermath of that fateful flight. But today's version included updates from the lives touched by those events. George, now fully recovered, was shown teaching his grandchildren about respect for veterans. Elisa had become a national trainer for the Harrison Protocol, which had been adopted by major airlines across the country. "Since that day," Harrison continued, "we've received reports of over 300 in-flight medical emergencies where veterans stepped forward to help. 300 moments where training met opportunity, where service continued long after the uniform was put away." The statistics flashed behind him. Lives saved, emergencies handled, veterans recognized for their ongoing service to their communities. Bradley stood up next, sharing his perspective on the events that had transformed his understanding of service. "We thought we were going to make a funny video that day," he admitted to the audience. "Instead, we learned what real strength looks like, what real service means." His Marine brother, now a captain, watched proudly from the side of the stage. Chase, dressed in his new paramedic uniform, described how witnessing Harrison's calm expertise had inspired his career change. "I used to think emergency response was just about rushing in with sirens blaring," he explained. "Now I understand it's about maintaining composure, about being prepared, about treating every person with dignity, regardless of circumstances." The program they were launching today would connect veteran mentors with young people interested in emergency services and military careers. Tyler's documentary series had evolved into a full-scale educational initiative being implemented in schools across the country. Mason's Veteran Support Organization had grown to include chapters at over 50 universities. George appeared on the screen via video link from Miami. His grandchildren crowded around him. "I'm alive today because a veteran never stopped being ready to serve," he said, his voice strong and clear. "My grandchildren are growing up understanding what real heroes look like, not from movies or games, but from the quiet professionals who walk among us every day." Elisa, who had flown in for the event, shared how the Harrison Protocol had transformed airline emergency response procedures. "We've created a network of volunteer veterans and medical professionals on every flight," she explained. "The program has already helped handle dozens of in-flight emergencies more effectively." Harrison returned to the podium, his presence commanding yet humble. The lesson from that flight wasn't just about medical response, he reflected. It was about breaking down prejudices, about understanding that service isn't a uniform or a t-shirt. It's a commitment that becomes part of who you are. The screen showed images from the past year. Chase graduating from EMT training, Bradley and his Marine brother working together at veteran appreciation events, Tyler interviewing service members for his documentary, Mason speaking at universities, about veteran support programs. Each image represented a ripple effect from that single flight, touching more lives than anyone could have imagined. "The skills we learn in service," Harrison continued, "whether military, medical, or emergency response, aren't just for special occasions. They become part of our daily commitment to being ready, being prepared, being there when needed." The young recruits in the audience leaned forward, absorbing every word from a man whose actions had proven these principles. Mike Anderson stepped up next, sharing how the incident had inspired a new generation of emergency responders. "We're seeing increased enrollment in EMT programs, more veterans volunteering their skills in their communities, and a greater understanding of the ongoing value of military training in civilian life," he reported. The presentation concluded with a new initiative, a nationwide program to connect veterans with emergency response training opportunities, creating a network of prepared professionals ready to serve their communities. Harrison had initially resisted having his name attached to the program, but had come to accept that his story could inspire others to maintain their readiness to serve. "1 year ago," Harrison said in closing, "a group of young men learned that true strength isn't about mockery or judgment. It's about being ready to help others, regardless of circumstances. Today, we're launching a program to ensure that lesson continues to spread, that the spirit of service continues to grow." As the applause died down, Harrison looked out at the faces before him, the recruits who would carry forward the tradition of service, the veterans who understood its ongoing importance, and the young men whose lives had been transformed by witnessing true service in action. Each person in that room represented a potential ripple effect, a chance to spread the understanding that service to others is a lifetime commitment. "Looking back at that flight," Harrison concluded, "I'm reminded that every day presents opportunities to make a difference. Every moment carries the potential to transform lives, not just through dramatic rescues, but through the quiet example of maintaining our readiness to serve others." The screen showed one final image, the plaque at Kansas City International Airport, now surrounded by photos of veterans who had assisted in emergencies since that day. Below it, a simple message read, "Service never stops." "To all those watching this story," Harrison said, addressing not just the audience before him, but the thousands who would view the recording, "remember that true heroes don't wear capes or seek attention. They maintain their skills, stay prepared, and remain ready to help whenever needed. If this story has touched you, if it has helped you understand the ongoing importance of service and respect, share it with others. Subscribe to be part of this growing community of those committed to service beyond the uniform. Together, we can ensure that the spirit of service continues to touch lives, one moment at a time. As the lights came up in the auditorium, the applause was thunderous. But Harrison's attention was on the quiet nods of understanding from the recruits, the proud smiles of the veterans, and the determined expressions of Bradley and his friends, each now committed to carrying forward the lesson they had learned. At 35,000 feet, that true service never stops, and that every day presents new opportunities to make a difference in the lives of others.